I loved Star Trek. Picard Season Three's The Next Generation reunion, but I felt guilty about it. When Star Trek Picard Season 3 arrived, I was fully prepared for it to be a nostalgia ride. I knew the marketing promised the return of the Star Trek The Next Generation crew, a reunion nearly 30 years in the making. And when it finally happened, when Jean-Luc Picard, William Riker, Deanna Troi, Beverly Crusher, Geordi LaForge, Worf, and even Data stood together again on the bridge of the USS Enterprise D, I was overwhelmed. I laughed, I teared up, and I probably rewound the scene more times than I'd like to admit. It was glorious. It was comforting. It was the kind of television moment that sticks with you. And yet, when the credits rolled and I sat back with my feelings, I realized something unexpected. I felt guilty about enjoying it so much. That guilt gnawed at me as I thought about why this season worked for me in ways the earlier ones hadn't, and whether my love for it was earned or simply a case of Star Trek playing my emotions like a violin. Nostalgia done right or manipulated? I've always loved The Next Generation. It's the show that made me a Trekkie. The characters feel like family. So of course seeing them again in Picard Season 3 hit me with a tidal wave of nostalgia. The moment the Enterprise D was revealed, restored, and ready for one last mission, I literally gasped. But that's also where the guilt came in. I knew this was carefully constructed fan service. Showrunner Terry Matalas built Season 3 as a farewell tour for the TNG cast, and it worked beautifully. But did I love it because it was great storytelling or because it tapped into my emotional memory of being 12 years old and watching these characters save the galaxy? On some level, I couldn't shake the sense that I'd been manipulated. The season was designed to be a crowd pleaser in a way that the first two seasons of Picard weren't. Season 1 tried to tell a story about synthetic life, trauma, and aging. Season 2 grappled with time travel, Picard's past, and even the Borg in a new way. Both of those seasons had their flaws, but they at least tried to push Star Trek into new territory. Season 3, by contrast, leaned into the familiar. And I loved it for that. But I couldn't ignore the possibility that I was applauding not because it was innovative, but because it finally gave me what I wanted. The joy of seeing the crew again. That said, the emotional highs of Season 3 were undeniable. Seeing Riker and Picard back in command together made me feel like no time had passed. Worf's reintroduction, with his new pacifist warrior philosophy, was both hilarious and poignant. Geordi's evolution into a family man, torn between duty and protecting his daughters, hit harder than I expected. And Beverly Crusher, so often underused in TNG, finally got meaningful development, complete with the introduction of her son Jack Crusher. And Data. Oh, Data. His resurrection was a risk, but the show handled it in a surprisingly sensitive way. Instead of simply undoing his sacrifice from Nemesis, Picard Season 3 gave us a version of Data who was finally at peace with being human. That scene where he talks about dreaming and imperfection, perfect. The chemistry was still there too. The banter, the quiet moments of trust, the way they fell into their old rhythms on the bridge, it all reminded me why this cast is one of the greatest ensembles in sci-fi history. So why did I feel guilty? Because I knew that other, newer characters had been pushed aside to make room for this grand reunion. Raffi, a character I grew to appreciate in Seasons 1 and 2, was sidelined into a supporting role. Elnor vanished completely. Soji, who was once the beating heart of Season 1, was forgotten. It almost felt as though Picard Season 3 had decided that none of the new ideas mattered anymore, because nostalgia was the surest path to victory. When nostalgia crowds out innovation, that's the tricky thing about Season 3. It delivered exactly what longtime fans wanted, but in doing so, it sacrificed the show's original identity. Picard started as a story about aging, regret, and how a great man can confront his failures. By Season 3, it had become a swan song for the next generation. And I loved it anyway. Which made me feel guilty. Because as much as I celebrated the return of my favorite crew, I couldn't help but wonder what Picard might have been if it had stuck to its guns and continued to explore new frontiers instead of circling back to the past. There's also the matter of fairness. Star Trek has always been about pushing boundaries, whether it was TOS addressing race and war, TNG grappling with ethics and diplomacy, or Discovery showcasing diversity in ways the franchise hadn't before. By leaning so heavily on nostalgia, did Picard Season 3 betray that mission? Did it take the easy route by giving fans what they already loved instead of challenging them with something new? The audience's complicity. Here's the uncomfortable truth. I'm part of the problem. I cheered when the Enterprise D appeared. I got goosebumps when the old bridge lit up. I reveled in the callbacks and the Easter eggs. If Picard Season 3 had been bold and experimental, maybe I would have respected it more, but I might not have loved it as deeply. That's the paradox. As fans, we often say we want Star Trek to be daring and forward-looking, but when faced with the warm embrace of nostalgia, we melt. I certainly did. And I think that's why I felt guilty, because my enjoyment seemed to validate the idea that Star Trek should just keep mining the past instead of charting new territory. Why the reunion still mattered. At the same time, maybe I'm being too harsh on myself. Because the reunion wasn't just empty fan service. It was thematically tied to Picard's story. Season 3 explored his legacy, his connection to his old crew, and his newfound role as a father. The return of the TNG characters gave weight to that journey. They weren't just cameos, they had arcs, choices, and consequences. The nostalgia worked because it was rooted in character. Seeing the crew together again wasn't just a wink at the audience. It was the culmination of decades of storytelling. Maybe that's why it landed so well, because it wasn't just about me as a fan, it was about them as a family. Reconciling love and guilt. In the end, I've come to accept that it's okay to feel both love and guilt about Picard Season 3. I loved it because it reminded me of why I fell in love with Star Trek in the first place. I felt guilty because I knew it leaned on nostalgia instead of blazing a new trail. Both things can be true at once. What I've realized is that maybe Picard Season 3 didn't need to reinvent the wheel. It wasn't meant to be the future of Star Trek. It was meant to be the farewell, the closing chapter, the one last mission for a crew that defined an era. And in that sense, it succeeded brilliantly. Other shows, Strange New Worlds, Discovery, the upcoming Starfleet Academy, can carry the torch forward. Picard didn't need to. Its job was to give us closure, and in doing so, it gave us joy. Final thoughts. I loved Star Trek, Picard Season 3's reunion with every fiber of my Trekkie heart. And yes, I felt guilty about it. I worried that my joy came too easily, that I was being manipulated by nostalgia, that I was abandoning the more daring visions of Star Trek. But maybe guilt isn't the right word. Maybe what I felt was awareness, that I can embrace nostalgia while also craving innovation, that I can love the past while still hoping for the future. The truth is, I'll always treasure that moment when the Enterprise D's lights came on and the TNG crew took their stations one last time. It wasn't just television. It was a reunion with old friends. And if that makes me guilty of giving in to nostalgia, well, I can live with that. Would you like me to make this read more like a personal essay introspective, almost like a fan journal, or more like a pop culture article structured analysis for a broader audience?